"Strike three!" shouted umpire Billy Golden in his bugling baritone in the bottom of the first half of the third inning at tiny Admiral Fetterman Field in Pensacola, Florida, where the Pensacola Blue Wahoos, the Double-A affiliate of the Miami Marlins, play. On orders from above, Scout Sam Casper was at his usual spot at the Admiral to check on the progress of Davy Burcutt Boyd, selected by the Marlins as the #1 pick in the draft 2 years ago. It was the Scouts' second trip to Pensacola this season. It seems the big club was hoping that last year's premium kid would be ready for the show by September, and trusted the judgment of none other than Casper, who has been scouting for them for 18 years. In Casper's opinion, Boyd, who was posting a nice .286 batting average with 12 homers and 36 rebounds in mid-June, has so far justified the $1.75 million bonus the Marlins paid him when they signed him last year. The 24-year-old 6'4", 240-pound player can hit at a medium pace, hit for power, play first base, and run like the wind, Casper believes, making him perhaps one notch below the potential of Mike Trout of the Angels, whom most people recognize as the greatest player in the game. Boyd exuded confidence as he took the field as the third batter in the inning for Pensacola. His long, wavy blonde hair poked out from under his helmet, his large biceps and triceps tight against the short sleeves of his uniform. Almost all the women in the tiny gym straightened up and paid more attention to the batter. Attendance at the house was at an all-time high this year, especially among the women. Casper took out a notebook and pen to record the match and his observations of it. He was probably the only man in the park who paid more attention to the batter than the women. With the bases empty and one out, Boyd brought the count to a close and then threw a 96 miles per hour fastball over the wall in left field. The auditorium exploded with cheers. Casper, grinning from ear to ear, was furiously writing something. It was on his recommendation that the Marlins selected Boyd. Later in the game, Boyd made another run-scoring play, and the Blue Wahoos won 4-2. Casper made a few more notes in his notebook and then headed to the Wahoos locker room to talk to Boyd and the Wahoos manager. Alyssa Graber and Tracy Strickland sat at a corner table in the upscale La Scala restaurant, eating a slice of cheesecake each and washing it down with a shot of Galliano. The two 30-year-olds were well-dressed and seemed to fit in quite well with their surroundings. Davy Boyd and Arturo Gonzalez were completely out of place as soon as they entered the restaurant. They had come into the restaurant to celebrate a victory from the day and were shown to a table in the center of the restaurant. "Oh, I'll take that blonde specimen over there," Tracy said, pointing to Davy. Alyssa followed as Tracy shifted her gaze to a couple of ballplayers. "Oh, please. The two of them probably haven't read a book since Sally, Dick, and Jane." $10 says they both order burgers, Alyssa said. "It's a deal. Do you know them?" asked Tracy. "All I know is that they're two members of the local baseball team. Your fantastic boy is their bonus baby. We have a big deal to sign." Handsome and rich. That's always a good combination," Tracy said, and a slow smile spread across her face as the pair of athletes looked at the women. "Doesn't it bother you that they might be young enough to be our younger brothers?" asked Alyssa. "I don't want to buy it, just rent it for a while," said Tracy, flashing her perfect white teeth in the direction of the players. "Would you look at that?" turned Davy to Arturo. "A couple of cuties just waiting for company." Davy, as a player with a big contract and a bonus, shopped as he usually did when he went out with his teammates. He beckoned to the waitress and asked her to bring 2 more drinks to the women at the corner table. "Did you know that both of these women are married, and the one with the shorter hair is the wife of Mayor Richard Strickland?" the waitress asked. "That's all right," Davy replied. "I just want to buy them a drink, not rent for the evening." The waitress smiled and did as she was asked. The players watched the waitress deliver the drinks and then tipped their shot glasses toward the women. The women tipped their drinks back. The players ate their hamburgers as they watched the women talk. "Damn, boy, aren't you already entertaining that pretty blonde?" asked Arturo. "What's your point, Artie? We're friends, not married. Besides, there's nothing better than a married woman. I teach Blondie how to have fun, but I bet these blondes can teach us how to have fun." My hat's off to you, Professor. Both players chuckled. Alyssa was the wife of a banker. She was 36 years old. Her partner at the table was 35. By the way, you owe me $10, Alyssa remarked. The players finished their burgers, then approached the women's table. Would you like some company for a while? Davy asked Davy. Who do you have in mind? Asked Tracy cheekily. Davy didn't have time to answer. He was a seasoned pro at dealing with women and recognized Tracy's reaction as the first salvo. He decided Arturo could be calmer. Well, since you're the feisty one, I thought to myself, Arturo is more of a gentleman. I think he would be good company for your friend. My name is Davy, by the way. Arturo and I play for the Blue Wahoos, the Double-A baseball team in town. I'm Tracy, and my friend's name is Alyssa. I think we can have a little conversation about something intelligent if you can handle it. Arturo seems like he can handle it. Maybe he can cover for both of you. Whoa. Ouch, Davy said. The four enjoyed each other's company, taking a second drink and sitting around for about 2 hours. Before they parted ways, Davy asked for and received Tracy's phone number. Did you really just give him your number? Alyssa asked incredulously. Incredulously asked Alyssa. You do remember you're a married woman, right? A little flirting, maybe a little more. Never hurt anyone. I can see he's a player. I'll just play along with him a little, Tracy laughed. As long as you know what you're doing, Alyssa commented. Heading the other way, Arturo asked Davy, Are you kicking Blondie to the curb? What makes you think I'd do something so stupid? Replied Davy. Blondie and Tracy don't run in the same circles. As long as you know what you're doing, said Arturo. Blondie, as the two Wahoo players called her, was actually a 20-year-old Pensacola native named Jenna Wyatt. She showed up outside the team's locker room after the first game, and she and Davy haven't parted ways since. Jenna was hardly an innocent townie. Although she had only been out of high school for 2 years, her number was already double digits. She was young and not shy about pursuing what she wanted. At the moment, she needed a baseball player. Jenna was waiting for Davy the day after the game. They left the park and headed to the house Davy was renting, stopping for pizza. After dealing with the pizza and having a couple beers each, Davy and Jenna retreated to the master bedroom where there was a queen-sized bed. That's where they got down to it. Tracy didn't recognize the number that popped up on her phone's display at first. Then she remembered that she had given her number to that young ball player 4 days ago. She giggled loudly. She didn't think he would actually call, since he knew she was married. He's either incredibly brazen or incredibly stupid, she thought, as she hit the answer button. Davy, how are you doing? Tracy replied in her sweetest tone. Very well, Tracy. I was just sitting in my room thinking about tonight's game when you came to my mind, and I decided to call. Are you home or on the road? Asked Tracy, catching Davy off guard as to what she even knew about road trips. From their conversation yesterday, Davy had gotten the impression that she knew very little about the sport, and was even less interested in it. We're in Birmingham. We'll be back home in a few days. I was hoping that on Thursday night, if you don't have anything to do, we could have a quick bite to eat and a drink. You can bring hubby if you want. I'd love to meet the mayor. I've never officially met him before. I bet you two are quite the power couple. Tracy caught the note of sarcasm in Davy's voice. She knew he didn't want her husband to join them, but was amazed that Davy had the sense to play the game. Tracy was intrigued. He has a council meeting on Thursday night, but I'd love to join you, young man, Tracy replied, inserting ID as a way of running the game. Over glasses of amaretto di Serrano and slices of cheesecake, they got to know each other better. Tracy kept the conversation neutral, letting Davy choose the direction of the evening. He waited about 20 minutes before turning the conversation to more intimate topics. You are a beautiful woman. Does your husband mind that you sometimes meet men for drinks? Asked Davy. Sometimes I go out with men. Sometimes I meet women. I have a diverse circle of friends. My husband knows that. He also knows he can trust me, even though he knows I'm a bit of a flirt. A little flirtatious? commented Davy. I'd settle for a little flirting. How far does that flirting go? How far would you want it to go? Replied Tracy. A smirk slowly spread across Davy's face. He stretched both arms across the table. Tracy put her hands in his. Evan McComb watched the pretty blonde make her way to the Starbucks counter from a table in the back of the store. He noted the light freckles on the bridge of her nose and the light in her hazel eyes. He also noted that her miniskirt only went halfway down her slender thighs. He knew she came here regularly and waited for her. It took about a month before he worked up the courage to finally speak to her. Nah! He got up from the table and lingered at the door waiting. When she approached, Evan took a step forward and introduced himself to her. Surprised at first, the girl reacted positively to Evan's introduction. She had seen him before in the store and was impressed with his appearance and the way he fit in his suits. They walked back to the table Evan had left and talked for about 5 minutes, after which Jenna said she had to get back to work. Evan handed the girl his phone to put her number in his contacts. Evan practically floated back to his job as an accountant. His co-workers noted that the usually unimpressive accountant seemed to hum as he moved around the office. Around 4 in the afternoon, Evan's boss, Phil Cunningham, walked into his office and asked if he had won the lottery. Today I got the phone number of the future Mrs. Evan McComb, stated Evan. Phil had been Evan's boss for 2 years now. He liked the young man, but he had never known him to speak so positively about his relationship with a woman, especially when they hadn't even gone on a date yet. Evan called Jenna the next day. They had arranged to have dinner at one of Evan's favorite seafood restaurants the following Saturday night. Evan ahed when Jenna opened her apartment door in her version of a black dress. So can I take that as a sign of approval, or are you having an asthma attack? Offered Jenna. It's definitely a sound of approval. But now I'm worried because I didn't bring a baseball bat with me to fight off the guys hitting on you. Jenna giggled, and Evan was sure it was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. They had a lovely dinner and a great conversation. Naturally, throughout the evening, Jenna compared Evan to Davy. While Davy won in most physical aspects, Jenna found that Evan was far from a troll, and she had to admit to herself that she seemed to match him on a much higher level than she did Davy. Nevertheless, she and Evan hadn't talked about their acquaintanceship since this was only their first date. They might have to discuss it sometime in the future, but right now they were just enjoying each other's company. The evening ended with a chaste kiss at Jenna's door. The next evening didn't end with a chaste kiss at Jenna's door. Tracy was pleased with how her relationship with the young athlete was shaping up. He turned out to be more educated and well-read than she had anticipated, and they enjoyed spending time at a nearby museum and the opening of an art exhibit. At the exhibit, they ran into several friends of Tracy and her husband, and Davy was surprised at how calm Tracy was about appearing in public with him. Although Tracy seemed as conservative as her husband, she knew that in another time and place, she might well have been a wilder woman. None of Tracy's friends seemed upset or surprised that she was dating a young athlete, although the pairing was perplexing to the women's husbands. Virtually all of her friends knew that Tracy was a badass flirt, but to her male friends it seemed over the top. Some of them wondered how much her husband, the mayor, was aware of her latest flirtation. In fact, Mayor Richard Strickland knew next to nothing about his wife's latest adventures. Despite her tendency to take flirting too far for his taste, he always trusted his wife to draw a line in the sand at the right moment. For the first 11 years of their marriage, Tracy had been the well-meaning wife of a prosperous attorney, and a little over 2 years ago, the attorney had decided he needed to become mayor of the small town in which they lived. At 41, Richard was 6 years older than his wife, but, like her, looked younger. His short brown hair showed no signs of graying, and regular gym sessions gave him a trim and somewhat muscular physique. By all accounts, he was a good-looking man, although he fell short of his beautiful wife. There was little competition in the fall election, with Richard receiving about 2/3 of the vote. Most of his constituents seemed confident that he would bring the same solid work ethic to the job of mayor that he had brought to his career as a lawyer. Like most mayors, Richard had a lot of meetings, and he probably hadn't spent this much time at work since he started his law firm career. Some of his friends wondered if he was spending too much time on the mayoralty to the detriment of his marriage, especially when they saw Tracy on a date with Davy. Tracy was the executive director of a nonprofit organization in town. Her job only took up 30 hours a week, which allowed her to have a free social life and still be present in the community. It was not uncommon for Tracy to have lunch each week in the presence of some influential business leaders. In recent weeks, Tracy and Davy had begun exchanging light kisses in public. Tracy had noticed that this was hardly surprising in some companies. She realized that it was only a matter of time before Davy became her first lover. Although she admitted to herself that she knew it was wrong, her growing lust for the young man overwhelmed her guilt. Although deep down she truly loved her husband, lustful feelings made her feel it was her duty to do so. Jenna felt no guilt after the couple had just engaged in it for the first time. Mayor Richard Strickland and 3 other men sat in a dark corner of the city's only upscale Hungarian restaurant. They were working out the details of financing for a distribution center they were going to open in the city. The distribution center could potentially bring several hundred jobs and tax revenue to the city. He needed to stay extremely focused for the meeting. His focus waned a bit, however, when he saw his wife, accompanied by the city's baseball star AA, slip into the restaurant and be escorted to a table in another part of the diner. And that pretty boy is a big son of a bitch, the mayor thought to himself. She's getting more and more brazen lately. He gave himself another 5 seconds to mull over what he'd seen, then tuned back into the meeting. Davy was more animated than Tracy had seen him before. He was today's hero. 2 home runs, 3 hits, and 3 RBIs, he told Tracy. She had no idea what this handsome young man was talking about, but she knew from his smile, the liveliness and the light in his eyes, that it was something good. She knew tonight would take their relationship to the next level. Throughout dinner, Davy grew softer, and Tracy watched his transformation with quiet pride, feeling that she had a hand in shaping this young man's personality. "How about we order dessert?" asked Tracy, giving him her trademark smile. "Richard won't be home until midnight. We won't have more than 3 hours to eat this dessert." "Hell yeah," Davy enthused. 15 seconds later, they were at it. Richard Strickland, half pacing, half staggering, entered his house at 12:30 a.m. feeling like a conquering hero. His presence and work had brought a distribution center to his town, creating many jobs and increasing tax revenues. The deal was sealed over a gourmet dinner and many drinks at Magyar's, an upscale Hungarian restaurant. Now, as he slowly climbed the stairs, he remembered what he had seen in the restaurant: his wife in the presence of the city's star player, Davy Boyd. As the executive director of a major city nonprofit, Tracy could have been with the player for any number of legitimate reasons. But if she had been, his very organized wife would have told him beforehand. He couldn't remember a single conversation in which she'd told him she was going to meet with Boyd. Richard knew his wife was a big flirt, and he had every reason to be, but he also believed that her flirting was just flirting and nothing more. Every once in a while during their 10 years of marriage, he had his doubts, but every time he did a check, Tracy turned out to be innocent. He hoped that would be the case this time. Tracy was the smartest paralegal Richard had ever hired at his law firm, Atterbury Salerno Strickland LLP. They started dating a year later and married a year after that. She left the law firm right after they started dating and started working for a nonprofit organization a few months after she and Richard married. Richard was 31 years old when they married. Before meeting Tracy, he had had 2 long-term affairs. He was a handsome, successful attorney, and finding a woman to date was not difficult for him. Tracy's flirting occasionally became a point of contention in their marriage. Her husband had told her more than once that in their place in urban society, her flirting was very disrespectful to him. "Cut it out, Richie. You know I don't mean anything by it. I'm just having fun," Tracy said. "Please think about my feelings sometimes, Tracy," Richard replied. Richard slowly undressed in the darkness of the bedroom so as not to wake his wife. He slowly climbed under the covers and snuggled up to Tracy, first smelling her skin and then her hair. The smell of soap and shampoo was still strong, meaning she had showered before going to bed. Since Tracy didn't usually shower before bed, Richard realized that his wife was no longer alone. He turned in bed so that his back was to his wife. A tear leaked from his eyes as he drifted into sleep. "So who are you dating now, girlfriend?" asked Sheila Williamson to her longtime friend Jenna Wyatt as they finished lunch. Jenna blushed thickly as she pondered whether or not she should tell her friend the truth about dating two guys on a regular basis. She wondered why she felt guilty about it, since neither she nor either man had discussed an exclusive relationship. Perhaps it was the fact that Shayla had known her long enough to realize that in her 20s, Jenna was far from a virgin. Shayla saw the deep blush and realized what it meant. "So I guess it's not a matter of who, but how much," Shayla giggled. "Come on, spit it out." Jenna looked at the floor before turning to face her friend. She told her about Davy and Evan. "Wait, you're dating that handsome soccer player? How's that?" asked Sheila. "He's just like you see him," replied Jenna. "He's big, he's got muscles, he's got money, he's great looking, and he's amazing in bed. But it's the other guy that turns me on. Not as big, not as muscular, definitely not as moneyed. But he's handsome and good in bed, too. And I don't know. There's something about him that turns me on in a way that Davy doesn't. We can talk about anything, and he's just fun to be with. And I miss him when I'm alone. I don't miss Davy that way when I'm alone. Make sense?" "That sounds suspiciously like love, babe," Sheila said. "You need to see if you can lock him up before he goes off to someone else. A baseball player may be fun, but love is gold. Hurry up and claim it for yourself, Jenna." Jenna looked straight into her friend's eyes. She could see that Sheila was completely serious. "Sometimes when Davy calls, I realize he just wants to have fun," Jenna admitted. "Evan wants to be with me." There's your answer to that question, Jenna. Despite that conversation, Jenna didn't hesitate to say yes when Davy called and set up a date 2 days later. He had sent a ticket to the game, and they were to go on a date afterward. Evan and his friend Scott Segura had good tickets to the Wahoos game Thursday night. When Davy Boyd scored a 2-run homer in the 6th inning, the stadium erupted into cheers. Evan, sitting 5 rows away from the Wahoos' first base dugout, thought he heard a familiar voice over the din. 3 rows in front of him, in the row just behind the dugout where the player's family and friends sat Jenna. She was well-dressed, but seemed to be sitting alone. Evan didn't say anything to his friend, but continued to watch Jenna over the next few games. He noticed that Davy stood up a few times and looked directly at the young blonde, and she seemed to wave her hand in his direction a couple times. Evan wasn't born yesterday and knew what he was looking at. He was uncomfortable, but as she sat on the podium and thought about it, he realized that neither he nor Jenna had ever committed to being exclusive. He realized that needed to be rectified if she wasn't already in a relationship with a ballplayer. Evan pointed out Jenna to his friend and told him the story of their relationship. When the game was over, the two men secretly watched the girl. When Davy walked out of the ballpark, Jenna practically jumped into his tight embrace, and they got into Davy's new Porsche. Tracy didn't notice the black sedan that followed her into the parking lot of the Italian restaurant. The driver of that car parked close enough to take her picture and see her enter the restaurant, moments before Davy entered it. He opened a thick Clive Cussler book, knowing he had at least an hour to read. Dinner took the couple a little longer this evening. They left the restaurant holding hands, then each got into their own car and drove to Davy's house. The sedan followed both cars at an inconspicuous distance. The driver took pictures of Tracy starting the car into the garage of the house. A few minutes after arriving at the house, Tracy and Davy headed for his bedroom. 3 hours and 120 pages later, Tracy's car pulled out of Davy's garage. A man in a black sedan took pictures of her driving past his car, her hair disheveled and her makeup gone. He then drove up to Mayor Richard Strickland's office and waited for the council meeting to end before entering the mayor's office. Mark Garton, a private investigator, waited until the mayor was all alone and knocked on his office door. Upon entering the office, the mayor recognized the man. "His bedroom is on the 2nd floor, so I wasn't able to get actual pictures, but I think it's obvious. And from what you've told me about her late shower, I think it's a done deal." Thank you, Mr. Garton, Mayor Strickland said, handing the private investigator a check for his services. After the investigator left the office, the mayor laid his head on his hands and cried like a baby. Breakfast at the Strickland house the next morning passed in silence, although Tracy was undoubtedly in high spirits and hummed as she moved around the kitchen. Richard looked shocked as he ate at the kitchen table. You don't look well, dear. We have an Alka-Seltzer pill in the bathroom if your stomach is not right, Tracy said. I have a gun in the gun safe that will make me feel better too, the mayor thought to himself. Tracy saw no indication that the mayor was more than guessing what she was up to. She had always thought she was smarter than her husband, forgetting that her husband's passive behavior had no bearing on his intelligence. Tracy believed that she genuinely loved her husband, but at the moment she thought she deserved her affair with the young ballplayer. Her husband was perfectly adequate in bed, she thought, but Davy was at least 2 notches above, and she deserved it. She knew she was technically doing the wrong thing, but it felt so good that she didn't feel guilty. She knew it was a cliché, but her affair was really just about having great fun. When it was over, she would be a loving and caring wife again. Richard watched his wife move around the kitchen and hum merrily, feeling increasingly irritated. He noted that he and Tracy had not had intimacy in about a month. As in many other families, the wife was in charge. The couple hadn't really discussed having children before the wedding, but about 2 years after the wedding, Tracy had decided that she didn't want children. She and Richard had several tense discussions on the subject, but eventually Tracy got her way, and Richard had a vasectomy. Busy with work and dating 2 men at the same time, Jenna hadn't noticed that Evan hadn't called her in a week. The next week, it suddenly dawned on her that she hadn't heard from her second suitor. By the time Jenna got home, it was too late to call Evan, but she called him the next day during her lunch break. It was the first time she'd ever had to call the young accountant. Did I do something wrong, Evan? Asked Jenna when Evan answered on the third ring. Evan carefully weighed 2 possible options. Tell Jenna that he knew she was dating Davy, or just forget about the relationship. For 10 seconds, there was silence on the line. Jenna, I know you're dating both that star baseball player and me. I know we've never talked about exclusivity, but I can't get over the fact that you're dating, and I'm sure sleeping with 2 guys at the same time. I know I don't have his money and I'm not that big of a guy, but I want to be the one and only in your life. I want to find out if there's more between us. On the other end of the wire, Jenna's eyes widened, though Evan couldn't see them. She hesitated for a second before answering in the affirmative. How about we celebrate our new arrangement this Saturday night? Said Evan. This time, Jenna didn't stutter and quickly chimed in. Yes, yes, yes. A few days later, Davy asked Jenna out on a date. She politely turned him down, saying she was now dating another man exclusively. Well, that's great for you, but it shouldn't concern us, should it? Asked Davy. It's not like we were looking for Brad and Angelina. We were just having fun. Can't that last as long as you're dating this guy? I'm sorry, Davy. Evan's not that kind of guy, Jenna said. And I won't cheat when I make a commitment. I had a good time with you, but I think it's over between us. Well, okay. But if you change your mind, you have my number. Love you, Davy. I hope you have a great career. Sam Casper had the honor of telling Davy about his September call-up to the big leagues by the Miami Marlins. One afternoon in late August, he showed up at Fetterman Field a few minutes before game time. Hey, Bubba, my name is Opportunity, and I'm knocking, Sam said as he approached Davy in the Wahoo's locker room. Really, Mr. K? Said Davy enthusiastically. The older man smiled and nodded. Hell yeah, I answer, shouted Davy as his teammates gathered around to congratulate him. The next day, Davy's call made the local news. Richard Strickland read the newspaper article with interest. He still loved his wife but was unsure of his next steps. He called his former law firm partner, Rick Salerno. A week after Davy was drafted into the Army, Tracy's hormones ran wild. She heard her husband in his office and realized it had been quite some time since they'd been at it. She tried to remember the last time it had happened and concluded that she and Richard hadn't had intimacy since she had started doing it with Davy. She and Richard used to have a vibrant life, Tracy remembered. When had that happened? When was the last time she and Richard had even hugged? Had she really become so detached? For the first time since the affair began, Tracy felt guilty. The young player was short on pitchers in the majors, and he hadn't been in the hot seat enough to pick up a woman yet. "Hey, kid, could you get away for a couple days this weekend?" "I really miss what we had," Davy said when Tracy answered the phone. "Oh my God, Davy, I really missed you." Tracy practically sobbed. "Tell me when and I'll come." That evening, when Richard got home, Tracy told him that she and Alyssa were going to go shopping in Miami for a few days, if that was okay with him. Similar requests from Tracy and approvals from Richard had been made over the years. In this case, however, Richard had in no way expected such a request and tried his best to hide his shock. Was she so desperate for his entertainment that she was willing to assume her husband was completely clueless? Was it really just about having fun? So much for betrayal, Richard wondered. Richard tried to hide the deep breath he needed to take, but then agreed. Tracy had just given him the ultimate answer, he thought. Tracy took a cab from the airport to the apartment Davy was renting. She threw herself into the young man's arms as soon as he opened the door. "Oh, but I have to go to the stadium. It's really important, babe. We'll have dinner when I get back." "I'm so glad you're here," exclaimed Davy. Tracy felt more energized and alive than she had since Davy had first left. Maybe it was the fact that Tracy was waiting for him at the apartment, or maybe it was the first of many great nights to come. But Davy had a couple hits, including his first major league home run, and scored 3 runs. On the way home, he grabbed some Chinese food and practically swung open the door of his apartment. Tracy was lying on the couch drinking wine. He placed the bag of Chinese food on the kitchen table, where it sat for the next 2 hours before a tired Davy and Tracy finally got to it. About the time Davy and Tracy woke up the next morning, Richard was going over his divorce petition. It was simple, 50-50, but Richard was only going to pay alimony for 5 years, on the condition that Tracy would pay her own rent and Davy would not live with her. Richard realized it seemed childish, but it was probably the only win he could get in court. Evan was practically jubilant when he learned that Davy had been reassigned to the major league team for September. He'd completely trusted Jenna when she'd committed herself to him alone. But the fact that Davy no longer lived in town was still a big relief. Jenna, for her part, realized that calling Davy to the team was good for him, but since she had committed herself to Evan, she didn't care that Davy was no longer in town. Davy and Tracy spent the better part of 3 days together, having dinner at several upscale Miami restaurants when Davy wasn't playing ball. Tracy felt the stares of customers at the restaurants, some because of being with Davy, and some because they knew she looked beautiful. She had to admit that life in Miami seemed so much prettier to her than in Pensacola. Tracy felt at ease as the cab pulled up in front of her darkened house. She hoped she wouldn't have to talk to her husband much until the next morning. Richard sat in his darkened living room with a full glass of bourbon and watched the cab passenger pick up her bag from the driver in the driveway. He watched her walk up the 2 steps to the front door of the house, hesitate for a moment, then put the key in the lock and enter the house, completely unaware that her husband was watching her intently. "You had to step up for your boring old husband after having fun with a millionaire stud for 3 days?" asked Richard firmly but calmly. Tracy flinched, not realizing there was someone in the darkened house. I, Tracy stammered, unable to form any coherent sentences. Jumping back a foot, she froze in place, barely making out her husband in the darkness. In addition to being surprised by his presence and accusations, she was also shocked that he had used F-bomb directly at her. He had never used such language to his wife before. "I know exactly what you're thinking," he continued. "How did your stupid cuckold husband find out about your trip? Or your lover at all?" Richard sipped from his glass, and Tracy stared at him in the darkness. Although she and many others considered themselves smarter than her husband, she was caught off guard and at a loss for words. "Don't worry, Alyssa didn't give you away, Richard snorted. I knew you were going alone, but I called her house to confirm. When Glenn picked up the phone, I asked to speak to Alyssa, and he almost fell through the floor trying not to lie to me but to tell me she wasn't there. That's the problem with using a woman with a good and honest husband as a cover. I asked him not to tell Alyssa that I had called so she wouldn't call you to warn you. He felt obligated to keep my secret. Tracy sighed slightly. Since she didn't know exactly how much Richard knew, anything she could say for herself would be imprudent. Silence was the best choice in this case, Tracy knew. Richard knew it too, but the longer she remained silent, the angrier he became. When did you lose respect for me, bitch? When did you stop loving me? Hissed Richard. I never stopped loving you, Richard. It has nothing to do with love. Well, maybe a little, to be honest. Wow. Honesty. What a goddamn concept, shouted Richard to his wife. Richard took another sip of his bourbon. Tracy set her suitcase down and sat back in her chair. Okay if I turn on the light? I want to see you when I talk to you, Tracy said. No, you just want to see my eyes to see if I believe your lies, Richard snapped back. Be careful, bitch. At this point, I know almost everything about your charade. The only thing I don't know is why. I'm not sure I can answer that question, Tracy said. Richie, you know I'm a big coquette. We've argued about this before. You were always afraid I'd cross that line, and I always swore I'd never do it. But I was wrong. There's something about him that's got me, Richie. I can't explain it. He was sweet, and he just had this. And when we started seeing each other regularly, I found out he wasn't just a ball player. He had brains in addition to brawn and talent. I guess I was a little charmed. More than a little, Tracy, Richard hummed. And at the same time, you and I haven't had any fun in about 3 months. And then there was this weekend. Did you even go to a game this weekend, slut? Or was it limited to just having fun? Do you really have to be so rude to me, Richard? Said Tracy. She looked up and saw Richard staring at her intently. I was never rude to you when you were my wife. But now that you've become his whore, all bets are off, Richard said. I'm still your wife, Richard. We need to talk and work things out, said Tracy. No, we don't need to talk, said Richard. I've already figured it out. I figured it out while you were having fun. Really, Richie? Back off, Tracy. Tracy rolled her eyes and pressed her lips together, but this time remained silent. So what have you decided, Richard? How do you envision it? You'll be served with divorce papers tomorrow. You'll sign them, and in 30 days or so you'll be off to your boy toy for good, and I'll regain a modicum of self-respect. That's certainly not how I envision it, Richard. I'm sure we can work things out. Yes, I made a mistake, but that's no reason to use the nuclear method. Let's slow down and think this through again. What we have here is just an inability to communicate, Richard said, mimicking Strother Martin's wonderful line from the movie Cool Hand Luke. Tracy looked at Richard with shock on her face. Polite, calm, poised. Richard seemed to be taking the possible divorce in a somewhat joking manner. What's going on here? She asked herself. Richard moved his clothes into the couple's guest room. He went upstairs, made his way into the room, and locked the door. Tracy sat downstairs, her brain working hard. She didn't think about the fact that she might get caught or what the consequences might be. Just as Richard had told her, Tracy had been served with a lawsuit on Monday morning. Even though Richard had warned her, she was sure he would have canceled the case. The fact that he'd gone ahead with it made Tracy a little nervous. The events of the past 2 days had shown Tracy a side of Richard that she had never seen before. For the next few days, Richard focused on his duties as mayor to handle the situation. It wasn't that difficult, though, as he really enjoyed being the mayor of the town. Tracy was coping with what was going on in her life much less successfully. She spent the rest of the day on Monday in something of a daze, and things didn't get much better in the days that followed. Thursday around noon, she received a phone call from Davy. Hey, beautiful. How's it going? Miss me? He inquired. Tracy's heart raced when she first heard Davy's voice. Then real life intervened in her thoughts. Richard knows about us, and has for a long time, she replied in an even tone. He knows about our date this weekend, too. I received a subpoena on Monday. Richard is your husband? Asked Davy almost rhetorically. He fell silent as his thoughts began to race. Since he knows, why don't you just come back here and stay with me full time? Davy said. We'll be back in Pensacola in a few weeks anyway, at least for the winter. Then we'll rent a place in Miami or Jacksonville, depending on where I work next season. It was Tracy's turn to be silent. Now that's the right answer, she finally said enthusiastically. How about we go back to Miami on Saturday? That's great, babe. I'll see you then. Just text me the details. Tracy put the phone away and sat in silence. It didn't take her a minute to admit to herself that while she still loved her husband, her feelings for Davy had grown so much that she was going to leave Richard for the young ball player. I'm sorry, Richard, she muttered to herself. Richard didn't come home for dinner Thursday night, but Tracy was sitting in the living room in the dark with a glass of wine when he appeared in the doorway around 9 o'clock. She thought the setting was very ironic and smiled to herself when he flinched, recognizing her as she walked through the door. Hi, Tracy, Richard stammered, realizing immediately that he was being set up. Let me get myself a beer and we can talk. Tracy had to admit that her ruse didn't seem to get Richard back on his heels as she thought it would. A minute later, Richard returned to the room with the beer and sat down in a chair, smiling crookedly. The floor is all yours, Tracy, he smirked. Richard's self-assurance made Tracy somewhat nervous. She started to look at the floor, but then realized her husband was looking at her in the dark. I'm going to go back to Miami for a few weeks and stay with Davy. We'll be back in October. That will give you time to sort things out, Tracy said. Are you out of your mind? Shouted Richard. You're telling me you don't want a divorce, but you're going to come back and have fun with this guy for a few more weeks? I'm nobody's cuckold. If you leave, you can stay forever, bitch. Richard jumped up from his chair, poured his beer into the kitchen sink, and raced into the guest room. Tracy smirked behind his back, truly believing she had regained her power. Tracy enjoyed hanging out with Davy when the Marlins played at home, but felt lonely when the Marlins were on the road. Davy socialized with the younger players, all of whom had young wives or girlfriends, and Tracy didn't find much in common with them. Nor did she have much in common with the wives and girlfriends of the older players, who were passionate enough about baseball to understand and appreciate the game, and she was not. Davy and Tracy flew back to Pensacola when the Major League Baseball season ended in early October. The couple returned to Davy's rented home, but after a few days, Tracy decided it was finally time to talk to Richard. She knew Richard would never take her back, but she still traveled to her former home to pick up the belongings and clothes she had left behind. Tracy was surprised when her key no longer worked in any of the doors of the house. She wondered if Richard had thought to change the locks. She ended up having to ring the doorbell. Well, the prodigal whore is back, Richard said as he opened the door. Is this what we're going to do from now on? Tracy asked. Asked Tracy. Absolutely, Richard smiled broadly. And Tracy told Richard that she had come to get the rest of her clothes and things. Richard took her to the garage where a row of trash bags were waiting for her. He opened the garage door and told her to load them herself. She hissed in disgust. Richard grinned and left. 2 weeks later, Tracy was sure she had lost her period. Davy fell silent when Tracy broke the news to him. We can take care of it. I'm sure the team doctors know who the best doctor is to take care of it safely, Davy finally said. Tracy began to cry quietly. I can't do this, she said. I can never do this. It's okay, baby. I've always wanted lots of kids. Maybe not this early, but I love kids and I've always wanted to have them. And I don't, Tracy said quietly. Tracy was 4 months pregnant when she and Richard signed the divorce. He hadn't seen her since she'd moved in with Davy and hadn't known she was pregnant. His face expressed shock when he first saw her. A new respect for your lover, Tracy. You never wanted children with me, but he must be much more of a man. Well, I guess I can't say you got married at the drop of a hat, can I? Tracy blushed, but said nothing. Richard's lawyer quickly pointed out to everyone gathered that Richard's name on the birth certificate would be considered perjury. Davy knows she's his and has already committed to paying for the birth and the baby, Tracy said quietly. The following season, Davy was reassigned to AAA Jacksonville. Since Tracy was already 7 months pregnant by the time the season started at AAA, she and Davy decided it was best for her to stay in Pensacola until the baby was born. Davy rented himself a small apartment in Jacksonville for the time he couldn't get home between games when the team was home. June 27th dawned bright and sunny in Pensacola. Around noon, Tracy's water broke. As planned, she called her friend Alyssa to drive her to Baptist Hospital. On the way to the hospital, she called Davy, he told his manager, and got in the car for the 5-hour trip. At 10:47 p.m., Evan and Jenna McComb gave birth to a daughter after a 6-hour labor. Evan, who is now an assistant vice president at the accounting firm where he works, cut the umbilical cord and felt like he was flying on a cloud. Dr. Leslie Scott congratulated the couple, but couldn't stay long because she had another baby on the way. She left the delivery room and walked down the hallway where baseball phenom Davy Boyd and his girlfriend Tracy Strickland were preparing for the birth of their firstborn. Dr. Scott liked the young baseball player and his older girlfriend. Although the couple was not married, she noted that the young athlete seemed to have a thing for the older woman, who was handling her first pregnancy well despite her 36 years of age. Dr. Scott, while noting that a first child for a 36-year-old woman is not that uncommon, also noted that the risk is greater for a 30-year-old than a 20-year-old. Tracy was careful to watch her weight and only gained 27 pounds during her pregnancy. The doctor also noted that the ball player seemed much more enthusiastic about the pregnancy than his girlfriend. At one of the appointments when the two of them were together, Tracy admitted to the doctor that she had a vasectomy on her soon-to-be ex-husband because she didn't want children. The pregnancy came about by accident. It's not like these two are the first couple to have this happen, the doctor thought to herself. While Tracy and the baby stayed in Pensacola, Davy went back to work in Jacksonville. 2 weeks later, he was sitting in a quiet restaurant with an older woman when an irate man approached them. "Who's your friend, Cassie? Does he know you're married? How many times have you had fun with him already?" he shouted to the couple. The restaurant became quiet. Davy looked at Cassie and vice versa. Cassie stuttered a few times before Davy slid off his chair and moved to face the older man, who looked a few inches and pounds smaller. When the police and ambulance finally arrived at the restaurant, Davy was lying on the floor. His right eye was swollen and beginning to stain. Harrison Walker, a construction worker and husband of Cassie Walker, had cut and bruised knuckles on his left hand. His wife was still sitting at the table sobbing. Davy was still in the hospital when the report of the restaurant incident hit the news. Of course, Marlins management was not happy that one of their high-priced players had suffered a potentially career-threatening eye injury. Tracy wasn't happy about the news either, especially when she heard the story that Davy had been at the restaurant with a married woman. Such a coincidence didn't escape her. "Son of a bitch!" shouted Tracy, addressing no one in particular. The noise woke her infant, who began to cry. No stupid act goes unpunished, the woman thought. Being only human, Richard Strickland couldn't help but smile when he heard about Davy's beating. That said, he felt not an ounce of compassion for his ex-wife and her predicament. She made a bad choice, he thought to himself, slightly twisting a phrase from the movie Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Pensacola police declined to press charges against Harrison Walker, especially since witnesses claimed the fight was started by a ball player. Richard Strickland asked one of his staffers for Harrison's cell phone number, and the mayor called the construction worker, giving the name and phone number of his divorce attorney. He also heartily congratulated the young man on beating the ball player. 2 weeks later, Tracy and the baby, whom the couple named Frederick after Davy's favorite player, Freddie Freeman of the Atlanta Braves, moved into a smaller apartment that Tracy was renting. Tracy had her attorney contact Davy to make arrangements for child support and visitation. She was still collecting child support from Richard. As fall turned to winter, Marlin's management was very concerned that the blurred vision in Davy's right eye was not going away. Insurance covered the contract, but nothing could make up for the player's potential. Hits, home runs, runs scored. Life as a single mom took a toll on Tracy both mentally and physically. After her divorce from Richard, she had lost a good portion of her friends, and the few that remained seemed unwilling to socialize with a 30-year-old woman with a child. She had lost only half of her baby weight before leaving Davy, and in the 14 months of living on her own, she had gained about 15 more pounds. Her chic closet no longer fit and was pushed to the back of her closet and drawers, replaced by mom jeans and bulky sweaters. Her hair had grown out, and more often than not, she just pulled it into a ponytail. The two-term mayor stood at a four-way sign in downtown Pensacola and watched an elderly woman push a baby stroller through an intersection when it twisted its ankle and fell to the ground. Being the gentleman he is, Richard Strickland turned on his blinkers, got out of his car, and went to the woman's aid. As he approached, she looked familiar, and he made sure of it when he helped her to her feet. "Hey, Tracy. It's been a while, hasn't it?" said Richard quietly, looking into her face. In the shock of her fall, Tracy didn't recognize the stranger who had come to her aid. Only the voice gave her away, making her look closer at the Good Samaritan. He looked like an aged version of her ex-husband. There was gray in his hair, and wrinkles on his forehead and around his eyes. His eyes no longer shone. Instead, they looked kind of sunken, despite the small smile he bestowed upon her. "Thank you for the hand, Richard. I guess I've gotten clumsy in my old age," Tracy replied. "If you're old, I must be ancient. Remember, I'm 5 years ahead of you. Let me stop the car and give you and the baby a ride home." Tracy waited while Richard parked the car. When he pulled up again, Tracy told him that she was healthy enough to walk home, but if he had time, she wouldn't mind having a cup of coffee with him at a coffee shop half a block away. Richard thought there was more pleading than asking in her eyes, so he nodded affirmatively. Tracy pushed the stroller ahead of her as they walked the half block to the coffee shop. As they walked, Richard's brain was working overtime. He looked at the baby's face and thought sadly that in another life this should have been their child. He shook his head to banish the thought, and Tracy cast a quick glance to the side as he did so. Pushing those thoughts away, Richard couldn't believe that the woman he was walking with was his ex-wife. Although it had only been 3 years since the divorce, Tracy seemed to have aged about 20 years in that time. When he first saw her, Richard thought she was a child's grandmother, maybe 50 to 55 years old. She only slightly resembled the Tracy who had once been his wife. Richard ordered coffee for himself, a salted caramel latte for Tracy, and warm milk for the baby. He had to admit that the baby was good-looking, a good mix of mother and father traits. "You remembered. How sweet," Tracy said as she tasted her latte. Richard blushed slightly. He just ordered without thinking. It was a reflex. "So how are you doing, Tracy? If I'm not getting too ahead of myself, are you seeing anyone?" Tracy knew Richard wasn't being pushy. He was the same as he always was, a nice guy. "I haven't dated anyone since I broke up with Davy," Tracy said quietly. "It was a real shock to me. I guess karma really is a bitch, but it gave me a chance to get a taste of what I've been feeding you." "Yeah, that hurts. I suppose it must give you a small sense of revenge." Tracy's voice choked. Tears stood in her eyes. Richard sat silent. Once upon a time, he might have rejoiced at her sad news. After 3 years, however, Richard's anger had subsided. The sadness had been replaced in his heart by revenge. "I'm sorry to hear about this, Tracy. Really, I mean it. I don't hate you anymore. I feel sorry for myself, and for you, for what we've lost and what could have been. And to this day, I don't know why." "It took me a long time to fully figure it out, Richard," Tracy admitted. "I kind of lost myself there for a while. I guess I saw it as a way to indulge my secret fantasies of being a bad girl. I thought I deserved it and could keep you in the dark, even though I wasn't really hiding anything. I thought I could have my cake and eat it too. Turns out my cake turned to crap." and all I got out of it was a lousy t-shirt, so to speak. And in my stupidity, I offended a good man and threw it away. I'm sorry, Richard. I say that quite sincerely. Well, look on the bright side, Tracy. There's something good in all this. He's a wonderful child, and at least he'll be around for you to enjoy growing up. Tracy looked very guilty at that statement. I know you didn't want kids, Tracy, but it just happened. When God gives you lemons, make the most of them, and never let him know he's not wanted. You have a tremendous capacity for love. I know that firsthand. Tracy began to cry quietly. After a moment, Richard handed her the handkerchief he had in his pocket. Of course, Tracy thought to herself. What about you, Richard? Is there someone in your life right now? Please tell me I haven't messed up your attitude toward all women. There's no one right now, Tracy, but I'm an optimist. You know that, Richard said. I guess I'm still a little fearful. Someday, I'll come to my senses. Tracy lowered her eyes to the tabletop so Richard wouldn't see how guilty she felt. Richard felt awkward. It was time for him to leave. He got up to leave, but Tracy put her hand over his arm to stop him. Richard took the hint from the many years he had spent with Tracy in the past and sat back down. Richard, what's the chance? I mean, you're alone. I'm alone. I know I screwed up once with the best guy a woman could ever dream of. But I won't make that mistake again if you give me a second chance. I can promise you that. Tracy raised her eyes and looked directly at Richard. He stared into the distance with a millennial stare for 5, maybe 10 seconds before he showed any emotion, and only then furrowed his eyebrows. God, you can't believe how much I loved you, Richard whispered, causing Tracy to lean closer to him. I so wanted to believe that you were just flirting with him when I saw you together in that restaurant. I always knew I wasn't a Greek god, but I truly believed you loved me, maybe even loved me as much as I loved you. I gave up the chance to have children. I really wanted children. You knew that. But I gave it up because I loved you. And you betrayed my love, betrayed my trust. And to top it all off, you had a baby. A baby. With that goddamn ball player. I may not be angry anymore, but forgive and forget? Not in this life, baby. Richard got up and walked away. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.